When President Joe Biden stepped down from running for 2024 presidential election, Vice President Kamala Harris elevated up to the top spot on the ticket, or at least she will officially here next month once they have their Democratic convention in Chicago. But it's pretty evident so far that she has definitely taken the lead on lots of things, whether that's because they want to promote her out there so that she can become better well known to the electorate, or whether she's previewing her role as president is unclear. It's not even completely clear that Joe Biden will continue to be the president all the way between now and January of next year. That's a topic for another day. But that just means it's more important than ever to really understand a little bit more about what Kamala Harris stands for, especially in foreign policy, especially when you're talking about this office holder will be the commander in chief. So we have somebody who's one of my colleagues at Defense Priority, Alexander Langlois. We've had him on before. He has just written something in the National Institute, which we'll talk about shortly, but he's also a contributing fellow at Defense Priorities. Welcome back, Alex.
Thank you. Thank you.
Listen, I'm really glad that you have just written that piece there. It's very timely for what we want to talk about here. And I just wonder, first of all, what are your overall impressions so far of Vice President Harris on the issues? And we're going to start with the Middle East, since that's kind of trending right now, and what's a lot of news breaking on that, which we'll hit in a second. But what's your general opinion of her capabilities as a vice president?
Yeah, definitely. So I wouldn't say she has the same level of experience as Joe Biden, although very few officials or elected officials have as much foreign policy experience as Joe Biden does. That said, she does have a relatively good pedigree in this regard. Lots of foreign meetings, particularly engaged on the Middle East, kind of playing as the bad cop, if you will, for this administration since October 7th, saying some sharper things about Israel, its conduct during its military operations in Gaza. And so, yeah, I mean, she brings a foreign policy know-how that will suffice for the U.S. presidency, although it is probably less so than some of her predecessors, and especially Joe Biden.
And I guess the real issue is going to be, it's one thing if she can read a teleprompter and read what's written on there. It's another thing. And we may not even be able to tell at this point, how much of those words are actually hers, how much of her own opinion is she putting out there, and how much is being given to her. Now, I would guess that right now in this early phase that a lot of it is that she wants to continue to be supportive of the president, Joe Biden. So I guess at this point she wouldn't want to be breaking with him because he's still the president, right?
Right. Well, and this is kind of the catch-22. We haven't had a situation like this since the 1960s. And what you have in this situation is a vice president who realistically cannot break with the president, at least not to a certain extent. They may be able to, but not too far, because the vice president is serving the U.S. president, right? It doesn't want to undermine the U.S. president's foreign policy priorities, especially given sensitive negotiations between Hamas and Israel, for example. That being said, she, I think, is aware that she needs to make a shift. And so she's trying to thread a needle right now, I think, in which she's still playing that bad cop, to, I think, kind of resolve some of these, these disagreements within the Democratic Party that have been realistically really harming any Democratic presidential nominees' prospects in November. And so she's threading the needle. It's not an easy thing to do. It did not go well in the 60s for Democrats after Lyndon B. Johnson. So she has a tough job.
Yeah, and it's all the more difficult right now because she's simultaneously trying to support the current president while also trying to defeat the candidate on the other side to win. And so she has to try to distinguish herself from him, or at least set herself apart from it. So I know it's a difficult task. And I want to look at some of the specifics of just how difficult that is. So as most people are probably aware of right now, the leader of Hamas was assassinated in Tehran overnight, Hania. And there's lots of issues with that. And Americans are trying to find out, or many people are trying to find out how much the current administration, which Harris is part of. And so I want to kind of get a running start into her view on some of these things. But first of all, just last night, I guess it was only hours after this had been made public, the Secretary of State Antony Blinken was asked what America knew and what is our position. Here's what he said.
Hania was involved in ceasefire talks in Gaza. What impact is his death going to have?
Well, of course, I've seen the reports, and what I can tell you is this. First, this is something we were not aware of or involved in. It's very hard to speculate, and I've learned over many years never to speculate on the impact one event may have on something else. So I can't tell you what this means. I can tell you that the imperative of getting a ceasefire, the importance that that has for everyone remains. And we will continue to labor at that for as long as it takes to get there.
And then this morning, John Kirby was also asked, actually just a little while ago, even just before we got on the air here, here's what he had to say.
Can you talk about whether the United States had any previous knowledge of the assassination beforehand?
No, I'm not in a position to confirm the reports coming out of Tehran. I've seen the statement that Hamas put out. I can't confirm or verify. We have no independent confirmation. But I can state that I also have no conversations around that reporting that I could speak to today.
So here's two of the senior members of the current administration, which could well continue to be there if there's a President Harris, whether it's sooner or after an election. And part of the issue they have there, especially as in the Democratic side, which you alluded to a second ago, is that they have a balancing act to try and figure out. Because on the one hand, they have this strong pro-Israeli branch of the Democratic Party. Certainly, a lot of them get substantial fundraising capabilities from pro-Israeli sources. And then you have another section of the Democratic voting bloc that is very much against what Israel is doing because they see the plight on the Palestinian people, and they have they want to see that change a lot. So the people who are on the Palestinian side showed that they could have a decisive impact or a significant impact in the electoral process when Biden was still running to be the nominee. So they know that's an issue. How hard is it to try to find that balance for Harris?
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult, especially with the incredibly fluid situation you have in the Middle East right now. I genuinely believe that Harris does not match Biden when it comes to his approach to Israel, although it is very difficult to match someone who says they're a self-avowed Zionist. In the end of the day, that's going to be hard for her to thread that needle. It's a very divisive issue in the Democratic Party right now, and there is a very vocal, not necessarily very, very large, but a large minority of voters in the Democratic Party, including a lot of youth, including Arab Americans, who are watching very closely to see what Harris does and says, and looking for more than just rhetorical changes, which is largely what Harris has done now or since Biden dropped out. And there's a reason for that. Again, she can't really dictate policy over Biden. She can try to show what she wants to do, what she believes through rhetoric. But it's going to be difficult before January if she does win the presidential election, does receive the nomination to even go to that election. It's going to be hard for her.
Yeah, and I actually want to, because there's a couple of examples we have of how she's trying to thread the needle but clearly tilting in a different direction than Biden, as we'll show here. First of all, here's something that she said a couple of days ago about how Israel does have the right to defend itself, but
Israel has a right to defend itself, and I unequivocally support Israel's right to remain secure and to defend the security of Israel. What we know in particular is yes, it has a right to defend itself against a terrorist organization, which is exactly what Hezbollah is. But all of that being said, we still must work on a diplomatic solution to end these attacks, and we will continue to do that work. Thank you all.
So I think she said that Israel has a right to defend itself, like, I don't know, 100 times in that short clip there. Maybe it was somewhat less than that. But I you can see she's trying to make them happy here. But then I think she tilts over to try to make Biden happy by saying, but we need a ceasefire. So what do you see when you see that exchange right there?
Yeah, I mean, I see kind of that struggle that we've been talking about. But in all fairness, what she said has been the Biden administration line for months now, albeit without many consequences when those lines get crossed. Looking at things like Rafah. That being said, she's been saying some of these more critical aspects, or at least the second half of that statement, after saying Israel has the right to defend itself. She has been saying more critical things about how Israel conducts its operations, how it conducts itself through the war. She's been saying that longer than most of the administration officials have, and that matters. That's a part of that rhetorical shift that we have seen largely in 2024, and that's something she's going to continue to play as she eventually most likely does get this nomination and goes into a head-to-head election with Donald Trump.
Now I want to look at something where she, I think, took a little bit more of a, frankly, kind of a bold statement. I got to say, this one surprised me a little bit. When Benjamin Netanyahu was in town to address a joint session of Congress, she had a really, number one, she didn't go to the session itself. So that was a first pretty big signal, because she went to a sorority event instead. So that just doesn't look well on paper, but it's definitely sends a message that something's different here. But then when she had this conversation, this statement that she made afterwards, it was anything but a full-throated support of Benjamin Netanyahu. Watch.
It is time for this war to end, and end in a way where Israel is secure, all the hostages are released, the suffering of Palestinians in Gaza ends, and the Palestinian people can exercise their right to freedom, dignity, and self-determination.
Now, a couple of things I want to ask you about that. First of all, just did that statement and the way she said it about basically trying to make everything equal and not a big full-throated support of Netanyahu on the day that he was speaking before Congress, did that surprise you at all?
Not necessarily. Again, she's been playing the so-called bad cop role doing this for a while now. Her Selma speech was a big deal in this regard. In which she questioned Israel's operations and how they were conducting themselves in Gaza. And so it wasn't necessarily surprising so much as specifically hearing self-determination so strongly kind of said at the end of that segment of her speech, which was also a strong speech from last week. And so I think what we're seeing from her again is this rhetorical kind of attempt to show that she is different, right? Using words like self-determination, especially as you see Israel come out very aggressively against unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state on the part of European countries like Spain, Slovenia, I believe, some of these other European countries that traditionally have been supportive of negotiations ahead of that self-determination push, ahead of recognition.
Actually, that's exactly the next part I wanted to talk about, given that last clip there, because she's saying we want a solution where Israel's safe, where Hamas has been disarmed, that the Palestinian people have, if not a two-state solution, a possibility of peace, and that basically everybody can just live in peace there. And there is no possibility of that right now. And there was I wish I had taken a chance to put it up here before, but there was a picture of her and Netanyahu standing next to each other, and few people I've ever seen are that uncomfortable standing close to each other. They're not even that close to each other. But he is adamantly, just categorically opposed to a two-state solution. And Biden has been trying to, that's the one right there. Yeah. Biden has been trying to say that for a long time, that there needs to be a two-state solution. And he always gets basically in your face thrown back by Netanyahu. If she becomes the president, how is she going to negotiate and navigate talking about these kinds of dualities that I want to see both these things happen when there is, unless she's willing to use American leverage, which Biden has never been willing to do, the second part of that is going to be nothing but a bunch of rhetoric, and the Palestinians aren't going to get anything. I mean, that's just the truth of it, I think.
Exactly. Well, and that's what I wrote in my piece, is that, realistically, we aren't going to see massive change beyond some rhetorical shifts, perhaps some more criticism of Israel before January. And should Kamala Harris win the presidential election in November, what we'll see is probably still a similar policy to Biden. I don't think it'll be the bear hug approach. I don't think she's going to call herself a Zionist anytime soon. I think that I think the interactions like the one the other day between her and Netanyahu, where they were clearly cold to each other. I mean, it was an uncomfortable thing to watch, let alone I imagine, be a part of.
Right.
I think that, we will see perhaps some shifts after an election, more in the way of maybe being less supportive internationally, diplomatically, than we would see, things like withholding arms, or those kinds of shifts that progressives want to see in the United States.
Now, what kind of message do you think is being received by the two different sides here and we'll just keep it on that last statement that she made there, where she's trying to tell everybody what they want to hear, because on the folks who are the pro-Israeli side, they can look and they can say, hey, her husband is a Jew, and pretty outspoken one at that, and pretty active, et cetera. So maybe they can say, that those who are on the pro-Israel side say, okay, well, she has to say all this stuff about the Palestinians, but I know that when she gets in office, she won't, actually act on any of that. So we're actually okay with that. Vice, the other side of that equation that may want her to be telling the truth on that they want to see a difference should she be elected. But then they also see that same kind of dynamic that saying it's one thing, doing it is very different. How will that play among the constituents?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't think it'll play well. I think what you've seen is increasing support for the Palestinian cause, especially amongst youth, over the span of the last few years and decades. I think in the end of the day, what you're going to get from that, especially with the amount of frustration and frankly some rage in the progressive and Arab American communities, against kind of this double speak of saying, oh, well, we care about Palestinian lives, but it feels like it's like an afterthought, right? I don't think that that's going to fly, especially for people that supported the uncommitted vote, for example, in places like Michigan, that Harris absolutely needs to win the presidency. I think it's that simple. And I think that unfortunately, a lot of progressives, a lot of folks are willing to not vote for Harris if it means that she.
Well, yeah, and I was just going to ask, have you seen any early evidence or reports, polling, anything else? Is her message where she, the comment that she made there on the 25th was fairly, I won't say strong pro-Palestinian, but was very tepid on pro-Israel on the day that Netanyahu was in town. Is it having any effect on him, or is it too early to know?
So from my understanding, Harris has actually seen a bump in the polls relative to Biden, and it seems that there's been kind of a surge behind her. Whether that lasts depends exactly on how the progressive movement, how Arab Americans, some of these other voting blocs in the Democratic Party view her rhetoric and policy stances going into the election, right? And this is, again, where it's so hard for her, is that she needs to somehow follow the president's policies while still trying to show how she would be different. And that's absolutely necessary to win this election, because I think the pro-Israel camp is has largely already decided who they're going to vote for, whether it's going to be a Democrat or Republican. There obviously are Jewish Republicans that will vote for Trump. There are, I think, more Jewish Democrats that will vote for a Harris, or we're going to vote for a Harris or Biden ticket regardless. I think the progressive vote is a lot harder to kind of nail down here because of these issues.
And here is one of the difficulties that Harris would have, that Biden has, in my view, just been an abysmal failure at, and that is standing up to the very, very strong personality of Benjamin Netanyahu. I'm going to play a segment from his speech before the joint session of Congress, to where, I mean, it's hard to see anything else but somebody who's literally playing Congress like a marionette and using them as props, if you will. Watch this.
Now, just as malicious lies were leveled for centuries at the Jewish people, malicious lies are now being leveled at the Jewish state. No, don't applaud. Listen. The outrageous slanders that paint Israel as racist and genocidal are meant to delegitimize Israel, to demonize the Jewish state, and to demonize Jews everywhere. And no wonder we've witnessed an appalling rise of anti-Semitism in America and around the world. My friends, whenever and wherever we see the scourge of anti-Semitism, we must unequivocally condemn it and resolutely fight it, without exception.
Now, as we've shown many times on our show over the months since October of last year, There's been many times where Biden came out and emphatically said stuff about, the two-state solution. We want them to not go into Rafah. We fill in the blank, and Netanyahu blew them all off. Sometimes in an emphatic, in-your-face kind of way, especially on local media. Can Harris stand up to this?
I think any U.S. president can stand up to this if they make the choice to actually do it. The problem is that U.S. presidents and U.S. elected officials, unfortunately, don't have the will to actually stand up to it. On top of the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu is a master of U.S. politics. He is. He knows how to manipulate this situation. He knows exactly what he's doing. He came to the United States for a campaign speech to bolster himself here and to bolster himself in Israel. And so what you need is a U.S. president that is willing to take a risk. And the problem is that you don't have U.S. presidents that have been willing to take risks to wield the actual leverage that the U.S. government has. And it does have leverage. It has a significant amount of leverage over Israel. It is the client in this relationship, regardless of how we try to talk about the importance of this.
Well, I think you should say it's supposed to be the client, but the way that the roles looked at, I'm not so sure it is.
Well, exactly. Unfortunately, I think that a lot of U.S. officials take the politically convenient way out of this situation. They remove themselves from having to be critical by just aligning with Israel instead, because that's easier. Unfortunately, the result is that you end up with a brutal conflict with the risk of a wider regional war that we have never seen in the Middle East, or at least not in centuries. And that's frankly unacceptable, and it's not a U.S. interest. And so I think that the role of any U.S. elected official is to look out for U.S. interests first. And if they cannot stand up to Benjamin Netanyahu, who is in an incredibly weak position in his own country, then something is wrong.
Right. Very well said. I couldn't agree with you more on that. Listen, in the time we have left, I don't want to just look at that one point of foreign policy, because the commander in chief has to look at a lot of different things here. And I want to look at least two more that are quite important and have some near-term present issues that are flowing on between the United States. And that is, first of all, in the Russia-Ukraine war. This was a piece in, I think this was the Washington Times, or maybe it was the New York Times, sorry, said that Mrs. Harris' full-throated support for Ukraine and its war against Russia represents an important moment for the vice president on the world stage and is a sharp contrast with Mr. Trump. At the Munich Security Conference in February, Ms. Harris assured world leaders that she and Mr. Biden stood with Ukraine, but could not guarantee the unwavering support of the U.S. Congress. Now, so far, at least what I've seen, is that she has been, as you would find appropriate in a vice president, any vice president, she has just been completely, mouthing the position of the administration of Joe Biden. So there has been no daylight whatsoever. In fact, she's even used a lot of the same language here. Do you see any evidence that she has a different position, like you do, slightly adjusted on the Palestinian-Israeli situation? Is there any daylight between what she and President Biden have on Ukraine?
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot of daylight in this regard, and I think that Munich Security Conference is a good example of this, while also showing that she does have foreign policy experience, right? There is a lot of support for Ukraine in the Democratic Party. There are some progressives that I think would prefer a lot more checks on arms transfers and these kinds of things, which is a traditional point for progressives. And I would say the broader, anti-war movement, having checks on arms sales, trying to prevent war, supporting negotiations. But for the most part, through and through the Democratic Party, including Harris and Biden, are in lockstep when it comes to this war. And that is supporting Ukraine, regaining territory, those things. When she talks about Congress, she's talking about the Republican Party. And I think, and frankly, I think some valid criticism of the war and not pushing for a negotiated settlement sooner. That is not something that she can necessarily control in Congress, even if she is the president, because the Congress is historically not very good at doing some of its most basic jobs in the last few years. And we're in an election year in which they're not going to even have the federal budget complete in time. They're going to probably work on it in December and January at best, right? And so she's going to do a lot of what Biden did. I think Republicans are going to do a lot of the same things that they did, which is negotiating very hard on things like Ukraine and some of these other issues. They'll take, frankly, false accusations of isolationism, because it's not isolationism to be critical of a foreign war and our involvement. But I think she'll do many of the same things that Biden did, perhaps, perhaps maybe not to his level of success, but we'll see. I think people are getting tired of the U.S. position and want to see an end of this war. So
certainly I'm in that camp, as you certainly will know. It definitely is time for a change. But all right, let's look at one other issue here, and that is Iran. So I think this one was this is in Deutsche Welle, where it said on Iran, Harris's policy appears to pursue a conflict de-escalation with Iran by trying to reach, if not a new nuclear deal, at least a new agreement or understanding that would pause Iran's nuclear weapon development. Now, this is a tough one because Biden was part of the team that helped negotiate the 2015 JCPOA nuclear deal, which Trump summarily dismissed when he came into office in May of 2018. Biden initially was talking about when he was coming into office, even before he took over, that he was going to try and resurrect it because that was part of his legacy, et cetera. Made almost no progress whatsoever. What will Harris do on that? Because there's the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, is one aspect of it, but there's also the bigger one that the Hania was assassinated in Tehran, and Iran has again vowed retaliation. And of course, if Israel launches its war into Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, that could also draw Iran into the war. So this could get real messy real quick. Where does she stand on Iran?
Yeah, so again, very similar position to Biden, very similar position to Obama. Her chief foreign policy advisor, Philip Gordon, is very supportive of the JCPOA. The issue that here at play is more that the JCPOA has largely become a defunct deal at this point, right? It's not unreal. You can come up with a similar JCPOA, but given the conditions that we are under now, given the timelines under the JCPOA, what's more likely to happen, at least under a Harris presidency, and I think what Biden has been working towards is kind of managing the relationship, trying to potentially find room for deals, and having assurances that there won't be nuclear expansion. The issue is that this approach hasn't really gotten anywhere either, right? I think the Biden administration missed out on the chance to actually renew the JCPOA very early on in the administration. And there were issues there related to the Israeli assassination of the leading Iranian nuclear scientist, Fakhrizadeh, and some other issues that really made those negotiations very difficult, such as the protest movement that occurred for Masa Amini. As well a couple of years ago. And so the issue that we have is that as much as I think Harris wants to be truly engaged on this policy, her team buys into what Obama started and Biden was trying to continue. I don't know if the conditions are there to push that policy. And so I foresee a Harris presidency probably continuing more along the lines of Biden's current approach of small deals, understandings, and that sort. However, what just happened in Iran obviously complicates that. And I think everyone right now is watching for an Iranian response or one of their militia responses very, very closely in that regard.
Yeah, which is going to make anything even more difficult. And that's part of the illustration for any American president is when a lot of our actions we've been unwilling to withdraw our forces from Iraq and Syria, for example. So they remain vulnerable to retaliation, which has already happened this year, where 3 Americans were killed because of the retaliation by some of these very groups that you just mentioned, owing to the Israel-Hamas war. So that has dragged that in there. Now then, this escalation could go up here, and if any action's taken, it's going to make it even less likely that anybody is going to have the political cover in Washington, even if she wins, to be able to go back to the Obama 2015 time, because the environment is now so radically different because of a lot of actions that we've taken up until this point, which nearly ties our hands. And that's one of the bigger frustrations that I have with our overall policy.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's spot on. And I think that kind of progression of issues it kind of lays the groundwork for folks that design these policies to say, oh, well, what about our credibility? We can't back away now. Right. And it's the issue here is that like you just said, you have U.S. forces all across the region that are at risk. You've had U.S. citizens, U.S. soldiers die. And it's hard to understand for what. And that should infuriate people, I think, because it's unacceptable.
Last question I got here for you. Who would be on Harris's senior advisor team if she should win, as far as you're aware here? Because I've heard some conflicting information. One say that she potentially would get rid of both Blinken and Jake Sullivan. And another said, no, she would want the continuity and would continue to go on with them. Do you have any ideas about who would be her senior advisors?
Yeah, so I have seen both kind of cases made, although I feel like I've heard more about Blinken not being interested necessarily in another term. And I do think that Philip Gordon would replace Jake Sullivan because Philip Gordon has been working with Harris for quite some time now. He does have the pedigree to do this job. And I think that would be preferable in the end of the day. He is critical of a number. He still has some traditional views, but he is critical of a number of U.S. foreign policy moves in the region, in the Middle East at least, over the span of the last couple of decades. He's critical of the war on terror. He's critical of regime change strategies. These are good things. Although Jake Sullivan said much of the same in his, foreign policy for the middle class approach, that is a little hard to identify at this point. But I think Philip Gordon is the big name to watch, and I think that if you understand his foreign policy approach, you'll probably understand what Harris would do in her presidency quite a bit.
Very good. Well, we appreciate that a lot. And by the way, I recommend everybody go look at your article in the National Interest, where you cover in more detail some of the things that we talked about today, and continue to follow your published works wherever they may find themselves. So thanks ever so much for coming on today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And we appreciate you guys too. Also, I want to remind you that tomorrow at 11 a.m. we have Colonel Doug McGregor, always one of the fan favorites on Daniel Davis Deep Dive. So be sure to like and subscribe. Tell all your friends about this, and we will see you tomorrow on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.